Energy Media readers, if you've been following my columns and videos lately, you know that the feds are soon going to be announcing a $15 billion support package for the Canadian oil and gas industry. Well, all sorts of politics and things are happening around that, including a Bill 12 from the Alberta government that was rammed through the legislature a few days ago, and it has all sorts of implications for orphan wells and landowners' rights. To discuss that, I've invited Regan Boychuk from a landowners group to discuss this. So, Regan, welcome to the interview.
Very glad to be here with you.
Now, look, this is a really complex topic, and we'll probably have to do a number of interviews to really get into the meat of it. But you held a press conference today, your group did, and asked for the feds, the federal government, to put some conditions on the project, their money, with respect to landowner rights at orphan wells. So give me just a brief overview of what you said at the press conference.
Well, we've been struggling with the problem of how to put Albertans back to work, cleaning up the oil field in Alberta, and the feds are seriously considering some aid towards that end. And the Alberta government just passed Bill 12, which has serious implications for how that might look. And so, coming on the eve of federal dollars, it's really important that we take a close look at Bill 12, because no one has yet. It's 30 pages of amendments to hundreds of pages of legislation, passed in 3 days. It's already become law before anyone has been able to digest what comes. And so ALDP has been watching, has paid close attention to the bill, and zeroed in on what we think is the most troublesome amongst its many provisions.
Well, let's start with your argument that Bill 12 politicizes decisions made by the Orphan Well Association. Can you explain that and give me one example?
So the way that it operates today is the Orphan Well Association is an independent nonprofit with its powers delegated from the regulator, and it would set its priorities, somewhat influenced by funding, its annual budget, but at least on paper, it's risk. They'll deal with the most riskiest wells first. But what Bill 12 does is transfer authority to the provincial cabinet, which would allow it to direct the work of the OWA and direct the funding. And so they could pick a priority and direct the OWA to fulfill that priority and direct the Orphan Fund to reimburse whoever did that work. And so what used to be a technical consideration, at least on paper, now has the potential for political interference, which is troubling.
And the irony here, of course, is that the industry has been complaining for years that at the federal level, the review of pipelines has been politicized when Prime Minister Stephen Harper did for his act, Environmental Assessment Act in 2012, gave federal cabinet the approval of pipeline projects, which now industry thinks is problematic. And here we go again. It's a little bit of irony here. So anyway, number two, you're arguing that the Bill 12 threatens landowners' rights. Again, explain it with an example, please.
So regulators and the Orphan Well Association have always had the authority to go on private land in an emergency. If a well has a blowout and the farmers in Arizona for the winter, it's not practical to negotiate entry with the landowner. If there's an emergency, they've always had the very reasonable powers to be able to come on and do the necessary work. What Bill 12 does is greatly expand what the regulator or what the Orphan Well Association and frankly any other licensee can do on private land without getting the consent of the landowner and without having to compensate them properly for the surface rights. And so that's really troubling. The landowners face enough, and this is going to compound their problems.
Another point that you made in the press conference was that Bill 12 incentivizes offloading wells to the Orphan Well Association. And of course, this could be potentially problematic because most of the wells come from the junior sector already. That's small companies producing 10,000 barrels a day or less. That's the sector that's really in trouble and on the verge of collapse. So explain how the Bill 12 incentivizes offloading wells from that sector, or any sector, I guess, but to the Orphan Well Association.
Well, the number of orphan wells has been exploding. There's not supposed to be any inventory, but it's multiplied from 100 to a few thousand. And their numbers have changed quite recently. There may be as many as 6,000 orphans. And in addition to that, there's more than 200 companies that have a regulatory score of 0 and are responsible for 8,000 wells that produce nothing. And so those are, it's a mystery as to why those aren't already orphans, but they could very well become orphans soon. And the reason that's problematic is because when these wells get transferred to the Orphan Well Association, the license gets terminated and compensation to the landowners ceases. And the company is no longer making it, and it gets transferred to taxpayers. The farmer has to apply to have the taxpayers reimburse them. And so it's an offloading of cost. It's going to save the Orphan Well Association money by not having to pay landowners, but it's saving money on the back of landowners. It's not a whole lot different than saving money by dumping toxic waste in schoolyards instead of disposing it properly. Sure, you can save money, but it's not necessarily the sanest course of events.
Given the short time frame, it appears that Bill 12 was prepared. Is it your opinion? What do you think, that this was kind of slipshod? They just didn't have the time to work out some of these implications in the legislation, or is this deliberate?
Well, our understanding from conversations with the government is that much of Bill 12 is in a reaction to ALDP's questions about how the OWA is operating, pointing out that they're doing things improperly. And so their answer was to make their misdeeds kosher. And so that's pretty problematic, and something we just needed to speak out about.
So essentially, they're retroactively covering their case with this legislation. So final question, Regan. The federal government's preparing this bailout package. What are you asking the feds to do?
Well, if it does seem like nothing's announced yet, but that does seem one of the obvious directions they could go. The OWA is a problematic institution. Its board is dominated by industry. It regularly misinforms Albertans about the cost of cleanup, and generally just gives a false sense of security that this enormous problem of unfunded cleanup in Alberta is under control. It's not. And so if there's going to be public dollars flowing into such an organization, we should be using that opportunity to leverage much needed reforms. And so the main thing we're calling for is these loans should be short-term. And to maximize or to minimize the risk of default on this loan, to ensure industry does actually pay, because any default or forgiveness is just another form of subsidy, and that's what we're trying to avoid first and foremost. But in addition to it being short term, we're also calling for it to be balanced with support for other stakeholders. We're calling for a fund to be set up for landowners who, under a Supreme Court decision, landowners can carry out the cleanup work of a well site on their land and bill the company for it. And so a federal fund could help landowners carry out that work without being out of pocket, and the feds could collect from industry. And so that's one way to balance the support for industry with other affected landowners. And the other one is to set up an equivalent fund to support First Nations capacity building, to put together a steering committee that would help put together Indigenous-led entrepreneurship that could help lead this cleanup work. Because regardless of what the regulator or the government wants to do, First Nations have the constitutional authority to take the initiative on these issues, to start the cleanup themselves. And that's another way the feds could help balance the aid that's coming soon to Alberta.
Well, Regan, thank you very much for this. We'll be watching the announcement of this package from the Trudeau government with great interest. And no doubt I'll have you back on to talk about what they actually do announce. So thank you very much for this.
Really appreciate your interest, Markham.